I am going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. It is 12:37, May 11th. This is the special meeting of the State Board of Education. And Maureen, if I could have you call the roll.
Sure thing. Tammy Colby.
Present.
Richard Werner. Mohammed Job.
Present.
Kimberly Gleason. Amara Severson. Jenna O'Farrell.
Here.
Gabrielle Lucci. Tom Lovett.
Here.
Lyle Jepson.
Here.
Secretary Boucher.
Present.
And Chair Samuelson.
Here, thank you. All right, are there any amendments to the agenda? Okay. Hearing none, we'll move on. The next item on the agenda is if there are any members of the public who wish to be heard. If there are any members, you need to hit *5 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. Okay, not hearing anyone. We do, well, actually, we don't have public comment at the end of this. So let me just leave it open for another minute, maybe, because now we're a little ahead of schedule.
Perhaps while we wait a few minutes, I could set the table for today a little bit. Would that be helpful?
Sure.
So thank you all for your time again today. I know that we've had one special meeting. We're having another one today. The goal of a couple big goals for today. One, we asked and we appreciate everyone who was able to provide their thoughts to us in advance on the initial copy and sort of initial set of feedback on the EQS, the version of the EQS that came out of our committee. And so we received two comments from state board members, one from Lyle, a set from Lyle, and another set from Jennifer. Subcommittee met a couple times, and we went through those comments, and you see sort of our detailed responses to those. Some of the comments that we received, first of all, they were all helpful comments and very much appreciated. Some of the comments required some additional consultation with the agency and also the Act 1 group, and we really appreciate both the agency and the Act 1 group turning around feedback for us quickly on those two things. And you'll see the written responses to specific items in your package, also from AOE and from Act 1 in terms of their responses. So we took feedback in. We sort of met as a committee and discussed that, and then did our best to provide responses on a detailed basis. So what we're really hoping to do today is see if there are other items out there that the state board feels like it needs to discuss as a group, or if there are other lingering questions that perhaps the committee or others need to help answer in order for individual board members to come to some decisions around sort of how they feel about moving this forward with a vote to approve or disapprove. And that would sort of start the ICAR process. But we also know that we did table one, I guess, substantive issue, and that is the to whom question. The rules apply with respect to independent schools in particular. And so for today, our hope was that we start with, like we did last time, the discussion around the content of the rule, and sort of try to move through any questions or concerns and discussion items around that. And then we'll stop, and then we'll shift conversation to the second part again is the to whom question, and then would like to have a thoughtful question around that. We've found as a committee to try to do those two things at the same time can be really hard. And so we're going to suggest today that we try to, again, bifurcate or handle those two kinds of buckets of questions separately today. So just to set the table, to give you a sense of sort of how we thought we might proceed with our discussions today. But I do want to make it clear what the goal is, and it's a goal. The goal would be today to come to some agreement around what we think, if any additional changes would need to be made to the rule. But our hope is that at next week's full board meeting, that we will have a stable draft on which everybody will feel prepared to vote. And so with that in mind, we've invited our counsel to the State Board on Decision, Bernie Lambic, who is here to listen today, because in order for us to true up a draft that's available, if we make changes today, in order for us to true up a draft, that's got to be done quickly. And so he's here to listen today, so he has firsthand information to, if we need to make any edits or changes to the document that you have right now, he can do that quickly and review it for any legal implications, so that we can turn around a document by the end of the week, so that it'll be everyone's packages for a vote next week. So the goal is to have a vote next week on this. And so hopefully we're able to resolve or come to some consensus around any questions or concerns that we have today, and do that today. So let me stop there. In terms of process and big picture, how does it, are there any questions or concerns on the board? And thank you again, Bernie, for sitting in today.
All right, so I'm going to pause there and do one last sweep to see if there's any public comment. *5 to raise your hand, *6 to unmute. All right, hearing none, I think we are now ready to move on to the board discussion. Tammy, thank you for setting that out. I think that's a clear framework that we can all sort of fit our comments into. And I just want to make sure, because I'd gotten a message that Tom got kicked out. It looked like he was back in.
Back in.
You're back in.
I
Okay.
can see Tom, but I just got a message from Kim. She's still struggling on getting in.
Is she able to call in?
She's trying to call in as well and not unable to do so. She says we've got a screenshot that says there is a problem. Please try again. Maureen, I'm out of options here. Do you have ideas?
I don't. I've not run into this problem before.
Either.
I did.
Okay.
I'm sure someone has, just not me. I don't know.
What's the solution? What was your solution?
I think I switched devices. I switched laptops. And I was actually prepared to have that same problem today. So I had somebody here that is more computer literate to help me when it happened, but it didn't happen today. I was so convinced it was going to happen again. The same, like I could not, and I got that same message again. I mean, that same message that Kim's getting.
Might be
So
her
it might be
now.
the platform, might be how she's logged into Teams. It might be something funky. I don't know if she has another device that she could try.
The app versus the web. Those things can be hard. I just saw a number pop up. 324-7145. I don't know if that's public comment or if that could be Kim. I don't know what Kim's number is.
I don't see anyone with their hand raised.
I see a hand raised now.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so sliding in right at the end.
That's Kim's number.
Okay.
Hi, yeah. So I have no idea what's going on, but I can't get in by any other means. I apologize. I'm listening. I'm going to turn everything. I've turned everything off and back on more than once. So I'm not sure. I'm gonna support Tammy's leadership in this conversation, and I'm gonna keep trying every other means. I think I am not being recognized by Teams right now for some reason. Sorry.
All right. Well, Kim, I'm glad you're able to join us. But yes, feel free to keep trying and chime in. As if you were on the call on the platform with the rest of us. And just when you were trying to get in, we've done the first two items on the agenda, and Tammy sort of set the framework for the discussion today. So at this point, I'm happy to turn it over to the committee to begin the discussion.
Sure. Kim, since
Tammy.
you're on the phone,
Yeah,
I'm happy to do that. So we did prepare a PowerPoint. I sent it out to everyone as a PDF. I don't know about you all. Sometimes it's hard for me to see documents on a screen versus on my screen. So you also have that, but I'll also put it up on the screen so everybody can see it. Let me do that quickly. Is everyone able to see that? Oh,
there we go.
Is that up for folks? Okay. So some of this I went through quickly already in terms of stage setting, but just to remind ourselves, I don't know about for everybody else, but it's always helpful to remember what our charge is around the standards, and that is to Act 1 charge the working group with recommending additional standards designed to increase cultural competency, attention to the history, contribution, and perspectives of ethnic and social groups, promote critical thinking regarding history, contributions, and perspectives of ethnic and social groups, commit schools to eradicating racial bias in their curricula, provide across their curricula content and methods that enable students to safely explore questions of identity, race equality, and racism, and finally ensure that a basic curriculum and extracurricular programs are welcoming to all students and account for parental concerns about religion or culture. So those are our guiding principles as sort of set forth in statute. So I talked a little bit about this a minute, but just to be real specific, there have been some committee activities since the last special full board meeting. We received 2 sets of written comments were provided to the committee from state board members, Jennifer Samuelson and Lyle. Again, thank you both. The committee met twice to review and respond to these, and in your package you'll see written responses to each point, some great suggestions. We also solicited and received responses to questions generated by the state board comments from AOE and Act 1. You'll see those responses in your package. And we've updated the EQS document where appropriate to reflect changes consistent with SBE comments. And in that document, you can see those highlighted in yellow. Track changes is hard in this world, and so we highlighted in yellow. The other thing we did is we added new text to clarify requirements for AOE under 16 VSA 165A for monitoring whether schools meet EQS standards. And you can see this new text in Rule Section 2126.2. This text was inserted to harmonize the EQS with the proposed AOE rules for the district quality standards. And it just basically clarifies the role and responsibilities under 165A for the agency with respect to monitoring and ensuring that all schools, not districts, but schools, comply with the EQS and that it's done so on an annual basis. And that's straight out of statute. So those are the things that have changed, or sort of that's the process that's been in place since we last met with you. And these are sort of the places where you can see changes. So with that, I think what we'd like to do is open up the floor now for questions and discussion around any additional items that I'm assuming I'm not sharing my screen anymore. Is that correct? I'm sharing my screen?
No,
okay.
We can see you.
Okay, thank you. This is a new version of Teams, and so the buttons are different. But we want to open up the floor to any additional discussion or questions that the board might have. And again, with the goal of trying to resolve any sort of questions or concerns or comments today. Again, we want to resolve those to the extent we can so we can get a stable draft that is ready to be voted on by the board. So let me open up the floor for thoughts. It's a beautiful sunny day out. Lyle?
Sure, let me jump right in. I guess back to the screen you just showed, and I'm going to pull it up on mine. It talks about monitoring.
Yeah.
I guess that was one of my concerns that I pointed out, and I guess I'm wondering about any increased capacity on the part of AOE to be able to monitor for changes that have been made. And specifically monitoring, I think, for the expectations of curriculum and how that will be cross-curricular. And these are maybe rhetorical questions I'm just throwing out there.
No, I think it's certainly a point, and I'll call in Secretary Bushy as well into this conversation. But it certainly is it's something that the committee considered. You know, in drafting 2126.2, our intent was to provide a broad framework that fell within the statutory, that met the statutory requirements under 165A, right? And those requirements are pretty clear with respect to what the agency is supposed to do at a high level. But, you know, our intent in crafting the language in 2126.2 was to provide a framework that gave the agency a lot of flexibility and in their ability to do that, and how they might approach that. You know, it wasn't within our committee's purview to consider capacity because the statute is pretty clear on what shall be done. And so the capacity issues, well, I'm sure they're real, and Secretary Bushy can talk more specifically to that. It's a tricky space for us because we have to develop a rule that complies with statute. And if statute says, as it does under 165A, the agency has to do some sort of annual assessment to make sure that schools comply with EQS. We can't really get around that. But let me stop there and call in Secretary Bushy into the conversation.
Hi everyone. Yes, it's a good question. And I would say a fluid discussion in terms of the broader concept of how the agency is monitoring what's happening at the local level, certainly with respect to DQS and some other pieces that are active right now. So we would, the intent would be that we would fold in, we would use the existing process for monitoring EQS compliance, and we would fold in the new language. We do that largely through assurances, to the extent that the continuous improvement plan that occurs largely through the federal statute under ESEA, overlaps, which there is substantial overlap with the EQS. We would certainly be using that as a leverage point. I think it's important, though, to note that, and I think Tammy alluded to this a bit, maybe from a different angle, there is still incredible latitude at the local level in terms of how the standards are actually met. So, for instance, we don't monitor at this point particular curricula. That is really a local decision. And so, you know, our stance is that we would do the same piece or the same kind of process that we've done with our existing standards, knowing that there will need to be more professional learning, professional technical assistance, and those kinds of things with these new standards to make sure that LEAs have what they need to make those decisions that are more local.
Well, thank you for that. Can I follow up, Tammy?
Of course.
So in my notes, or maybe I alluded to the fact that my hope would be that it wouldn't be an aspirational document, but would be one that could be operationalized. And having sat in the administrator's seat and things came to me, there were many times that I needed guidance and support around professional development, and having the latitude to create the curriculum didn't necessarily help me much. I needed someone to come in and say, and here is a template that others are using. So I don't know if we've already targeted particular curriculum that would be used as guidance from the agency of ed. I just think if we are looking for equity across the state and across all schools, that it might be nice to have something that we're pointing to as a document that is something that I wouldn't necessarily say is approved, but is a guidance document.
If Heather, may I respond? In that, what I would say is the Act 1 had a second charge. Group had a second charge, and that was to come up with a curriculum. And my understanding is that they're going to be coming back to us with a curricula around social equity standards, and that may be Jennifer, I think that's June that they're thinking about. And when in the state right now, the state board has to approve common curricular frameworks, right? Not specific curriculum, but curricular frameworks, just like Common Core or something along those lines. That curricula is going to be coming back before us, I would think sometime over the summer for approval. So I think that's one piece to the puzzle, perhaps, Lyle, that there would be a curricular framework. The Act One group would be recommending. But to your point, that might not be, it might not get us all the way there. So Secretary Bushy, you want to sort of chime in on sort of your thoughts around supporting implementation of the EQS around these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just addressed that by saying that, we will be looking very closely and have already been looking very closely at the Act One recommendations. We will be accordingly providing technical assistance in terms of further interpreting the standards at the local level. Part of our challenge, and we'll just keep thinking about this, and I'm happy to entertain further conversation with the board. Sometimes if we have specific grant dollars, we're able to actually offer really targeted technical assistance. We don't have an existing pool right now that specifically an existing pool of funding that specifically links to the standards. But that's not to say that we can't offer some statewide PD on that. So I think these are very good questions. With everything else going on, it's definitely something we need to be concerned about and be thinking about, which we are. We just have not had the time to really flesh out what that will look like, because what we're talking about is really the implementation now. And what we've really been focusing on is getting the standards to be where they're supposed to be.
And it's not a criticism. Yeah, it's not a criticism of AOE. There's so many things that you are asked to do and monitor and check on. And I think about, again, my experience with flexible pathways and personal learning plans. There is a wide variety. There are as many varieties of ways schools are doing that as there are schools. And so I'm not sure that there's equity around that. I think you can find, and I'm kind of going on a tangent here, I think you can find a school that might have a flexible pathway and another school that won't allow that flexible pathway. So I think often it depends on the staff and the training and the guidance that they've received. And it even goes to a higher level for me in that you don't have maybe we should have the power to encourage schools to have the same number of days, to have the same number of professional development days, to have the same teacher contract. And now I know I'm getting up to 40,000 feet, the 40,000 foot level, but to adequately and equitably, I think, implement something, we need consistency. So I think we need to look at our systems and how we're doing that.
If I could,
I'll be quiet now.
Could I just briefly respond? Because I think that those were some really important points. And I did not take what you were saying at all, Lyle, as a critique of the agency. So I just want to clarify that. High level, I would say this, just as with flexible pathways, this has been another, frankly, unfunded mandate, right, from our state legislature, which we're all doing and are happy to do. But I do think that it's kind of what I alluded to earlier. There haven't been funds allocated to the agency to really do this work. That doesn't mean we aren't committed to seeing the work through and really assisting with implementation. But one of the things that I think is really interesting even about flexible pathways is I think folks have a colloquial understanding that so those instances that you talked about where districts or schools are not offering certain flexible pathways is entirely consistent with legislation. So nothing in the legislation requires every flexible pathway to be offered other than CTE. So I think, what we're trying to do is do our very best to support the field who very often and desperately want to align with standards with, what the guardrails are around what they must do. And so I think, I just wanted to say that it's again in the space of that state sort of mandate and control versus what is really up to LEAs to actually, and districts to actually have their own independence around. And that's not to say independence for LEAs or their, right, I would say, in our current statutory framework to actually decide what they're going to do does not mean that they're left without supports. But I do think it's just important to continually remind us of that. So we don't really have the regulatory authority to say this is the curriculum that we're all going to use. What we can do is say, here is a great curriculum, or here is a great, set of professional activities that we recommend. And we strongly urge or strongly recommend that you consider this. So just want to clarify the roles and responsibilities a little bit there.
Lyle, if I could ask you a specific follow-up question, is in your line of sort of questioning and thought process here, is there something that you're feeling like is missing in the rule right now that we need to address in this draft? Or are you expressing well-founded concerns around sort of how we have a good rule, but then what's next? I just want to get clear. That's helpful to me because I'm trying to figure out how to facilitate our conversation around sort of stabilizing a draft of the rule.
Sure, and I think that because I've lived it for so long, at the implementation end, and how do we make sure we actually do this? There's so many great ideas, but we want to make sure that the idea happens.
Okay, thank you for that. I've been keeping track of hands going up. I believe the hand order now is Jennifer, then Jenna, then Mohammed, and then Kim is what I think I saw come up here. So
I was just going to offer, if it's possible, just some feedback to Lyle's thinking. You guys can hear me okay now, right? Finally, oh my gosh, 5th time's a charm. Good to see you all. I just wanted to sort of offer the challenge of what you're describing, Lyle, and the part that we have the authority for is crafting the standards to set out sort of guidance for what needs to be done, the how in so much of our local control in education does become the local body to navigate. And I also share the challenge that almost by design establishes sort of inconsistency around implementation. And I'm not sure that anything in the change in these laws has changed that. So we operate within a construct that's familiar and can be challenging. Just sort of a reflection on sharing the concern, but recognizing our limitations and our role in the standards. That's all. Thanks. Sorry to jump in.
Thank you for adding that. Jennifer?
So I want to go back because Heather had mentioned a few minutes ago the performance standards that the actual working group is working on pursuant to 16 VSA 164-9. And there's a lot of meat in the current body of the EQS, and I'm just curious. I mean, it sounds like there's going to be more meat in 160 in the performance standards that are being developed. So how do those two interplay? Do the performance standards that are being crafted, do those kind of fit into the EQS, and does that provide the how and the implementation, or is this something different?
So the performance standards are referenced in the EQS as the standards to which districts and schools need to those are the standards that they need to meet, right? So you'll notice the EQS reference to performance standards. The Act 1 group was going to recommend some performance standards to us. That's coming out of this process. And then as a state board, we will have to grapple with exactly that question. I think it's hard at this point for the committee to say much about that other than the EQS. If you search the document, you'll see that there are references to performance standards. The references to performance standards were there beforehand, right? Like we've always had references to performance standards. The standards that will be, promulgated in response to Act 1 will add to the list of existing performance standards, which include Common Core and NGSS and things along those lines. So, with respect to implementing those standards, I think that's a really important question that we need to take under consideration when we see those standards come in.
Right. And I think, to the extent that they're sort of talking about the same issue, it would be helpful to either have them cited in one place or the other. But it's hard to have a substantive conversation at this point because
But the performance standards historically have always been, like, we have a number of different performance standards, and those standards we adopt them separately and always have from the EQS, and the EQS just references them. And what that does is it provides the board the flexibility to adopt new and different performance standards without having to undo the rule, right?
Right. Well, I get that.
Standards change. So we wouldn't want the body of the NGSS, for example, in the rule because NGSS changes and shifts over time. And so by referencing the standards elsewhere and just saying, thou shalt comply with the performance standards and here are the standards over here, I think that makes a lot of sense. Heather, did you want to add to that?
Well, and my point wasn't so much that we would reference, like, by content, the performance standards in the EQS, but my concern, and I don't know because I haven't seen the proposed performance standards, is that the EQS is much more substantive than it has been in the past. And so, maybe, and I don't know, but maybe there's language in the EQS that properly belongs in the performance standards. That was my point.
I'm not sure that the EQS is more substantive, right? I think that we reference the principles of Act 1 with respect to equity and social justice, but there aren't performance standards in the EQS. In fact, if you go to this section under curriculum, and it lists out, and it's hard for me to flip documents, so somebody can give me the section. I should have all these sections memorized by now, and occasionally I do, but there's a whole section on curriculum and instruction. That section was not substantially changed. There were places where some of the principles under Act 1 were feathered in order to make sure that those lenses and perspectives are brought to bear on certain kinds of curricula. But the standards themselves haven't, right, sort of how the standards are articulated in Act 1 haven't changed all that much from the original document. Heather?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on this. So I have seen the draft of what Act 1, as a member of what Act 1 is working on, and it is a framework that does have, that really is framed around, here's what a set of ethnic and social justice standards would look like. And so when I think about how that interfaces with EQS, it may be that the board decides to put in that section where you have mathematics, ELA, science, all those different components, you may want to add another component there that says ethnic and social justice standards, and then a little blip about it. That's what's going to be coming to the board. So to the extent that, maybe that means you want to keep EQS open until this until this other piece comes in, or not, but just.
I think that's already done in the EQS. I think we already did that, that there is a reference to those standards in the EQS. Bernie's nodding. Yeah, it's already referenced, isn't it? We've already anticipated that in the draft that we have before the board.
Is it in that list along with the others, or is it? Because when you're saying performance standards, that's what I think of. I think of that list, which each of them has some kind of an assessment or something. And I think that's what you're going to be getting is information from Act 1 on how to assess each of these standards as well. So I just throw that out just as further information. And I'm just, I don't want to sort of like steal Act 1's thunder either, but just to facilitate this conversation, just kind of like, so I think this is what those might
So, and if it's helpful, just in thinking about the way these came to us, they knew that they would be doing that body of the work as well, the Act One working group, as you know, Heather, because you're on it, that they would be separately doing social equity standards, but that when they looked at the intent of Act One, it was not a discrete subject matter. It was the how and framing of all the standards and access to equitable, anti-racist, anti-discriminatory, inclusive education. And so as the changes are presented within EQS, I think they're addressing that broad lens of education and the environment that we're creating for all students in enabling equitable access to high quality education. I think what I understand, and I'm responding to your question, Heather, whether it shows up in that list, it is not discreetly there. No. And so I wonder what I am definitely not interested in us keeping it open endlessly. But when in ICAR, we will have received their suggestions for social equity standards and be able to add, if we wish at that time, the inclusion in the section 2120.1, where I think each of those, it says, I think mathematics and all of those we may need to add something to that list.
2120.1 is the instructional strategy. It's 0.5.
You're right.
And under this, it says that the curriculum, and this is again to Kim's point, the curriculum shall be equitable, anti-racist, culturally responsive, and anti-discriminating, inclusive, and accessible to families. And then it also talks here about the rigorous, relevant, and comprehensive learning opportunities to develop proficiency in certain areas. And you will see here that there are there are places where that proficiency has been enhanced by making sure that that the lens provided by Act One is used in thinking through proficiency.
But if there's a separate set of standards, we may end up, you're right, Heather.
Well, in 2111, adoption of content area standards, and that recommendation change for performance standards, the content area standards, I believe, came from AOE, makes it very clear that SUSD boards shall use the standards as a basis, and the standards being those adopted by the state board under 164.9 as a basis for developing and selecting curriculum, methods of instruction, locally developed assessment of the contents and skills taught and learned in schools. So if in fact, when the board adopts standards for social equity standards pursuant to 164.9, 2111 directs SUSDs to use those standards as a basis for developing their curriculum. And that language in 2111 is unaltered from the previous draft of the EQS. So to put the social equity standards in here as something different would make them different in the EQS. It means that we would be treating those standards somehow differently from all other curricular standards to which SUSDs have to comply.
The only thing I think, Tammy, and we won't know until we see it, is we're specifically saying literacy, mathematics.
Maybe it gets added to that.
We're specifically seeing some areas where, with literacy, and we're referencing the content area, and then separately there is a particular curriculum or set of standards that we've adopted. So anyway, I think that we can't know until we see, and that will happen before ICAR is done, for sure.
Jenna?
Oh, thank you.
I see you trying to get in.
I know. I wish we were in person. Could jump in a little easier. So, I have a lot to say, but I'm trying to be succinct here. I do think sometimes that when things are explicit rather than, I think adding to this list, the social equity standards is important now. I think transferable skills is also there. Transferable skills are embedded in every single area, right? So I think explicit is better. Like if this is what I'm a school leader, I'm looking at in my board, it's explicit when it's listed out. I think that that's important. I also, I had my hand up, I had my hand down. I agreed what Lyle was saying around this feeling really aspirational. And I think sometimes in my world around cupcakes, birthday cake, wedding cake. And I think this is definitely a wedding cake. And I wonder, the question for the agency around how many schools are cupcakes right now, right? Like we have a lot of struggling schools that, and I don't know where they sit with monitoring of EQS. Is this going to be a hard lift for, and what kind, and we talked about this is unfunded for the agency. This is unfunded for schools. So schools are getting absolutely no money, right, for materials, professional development. I also worry about schools who have already set their professional development initiatives for next year that are maybe in like a year 1, year 2 phase. And then this is going to come and where does that fit in for folks? So I kind of worry. Those are some worries. So I think schools, and also I know that schools who can, and schools who are already got this work, at a good handle on this work, are going to reach out for more technical assistance. It's schools that will fly below the radar that are like, how are we ever going to do this? And I worry around kind of those who need the most sometimes that don't get it because they're struggling to lift up other curriculum and other ways. So I kind of worry about that. I'm balancing all this with like, Tammy, what you said, like, so how can this change where we are right now? And I wonder if some surveying has gone out to schools around kind of the work that they've been doing, where they're at, where they need assistance in terms of lifting up social equity work. I just don't know if we have kind of that broader picture of where schools are at. There.
Mohammed, did you want to chime in?
Yes, most of what my concern had been addressed already, starting from, I'm going to go in order from Heather, Kim, to yourself, Tammy, and then right now, Jenna. And to echo what Jenna just previously said, I'm going to say an example is what we're going through currently at WSD, Winnebago School District. After we had an audit around our work in general, becoming an anti-racist school, we partnered with TNTP, which I'm going to put in the chat here just for your curiosity what that is. And TNTP has been really very helpful in really digging into our current situation, analyzing it really at a data lens, and then presenting its audit to our staff, our administration, and even to the community members. After that audit was presented, then they came up with recommendations. When the recommendations came, we looked into them, and now we are at the implementation phase. Starting with the implementation phase, what they first started to do is training the leadership team at the lens of hiring, inequities, justice, social issues, which I find very useful. I'm mentioning this just because we're talking about monitoring. After we implement this, who will be monitoring it and how it will be monitored. So this TNTP group provides a sample to guide each department throughout their recommendations. You can use this as a template to help you through the implementation. As for surveys, somebody mentioned surveys to see where schools are at, which is a very crucial piece. Once we know where schools are at and knowing the school's needs, and how do we know that? if it's not conducted by a specialist in that domain, we may not have the accurate information we're looking for to support schools in their needs, because anybody can say, oh, we're doing great, especially when you have to ask as administrators. It depends on who you ask the question. So the monitoring piece along the implementation is being done by TNTP. And how did we get this work to be done financially? We got it all through Bar Foundation. I'm just putting it out there again. If this is something we should look into that could support us, just sharing that piece.
Thank you for sharing. Having that perspective is helpful.
Mm-hmm. Without that, just, once we put in words, like in writing, people write beautiful or beautifully in documents, oh, we become an anti-racist, we want to do this, we want to do that, but are you actually doing it, and how are you doing it? And when administrators are not trained to do it, or teachers, when they are not trained to do it, how would the teachers train students to become anti-racist or culturally competent? So it's just start from the top to the bottom. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you. Heather?
Yeah, so I just wanted to gently and sensitively bring us back a little bit, which is, I think we're spending a lot of time on implementation, and I don't think that's what the charge is right now.
I agree.
So the agency is responsible for implementation. We would love to certainly work together with the board and be focused on that. And so I don't want to downplay that, but it's, I almost think we need to keep in mind that first we need to have the rules passed and encoded, and then we move to implementation. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard for us to kind of respond to how are we going to implement this without actually having the rules in hand. And I don't think any of us would argue that what we're assuming is that even within, 1 year, I mean, it takes a while for implementation to actually achieve what is actually encoded in the rules. So I just wanted to kind of gently, if that's okay, Chair Samuelson, bring us back.
Myself.
And I don't want that to come across as though poo-poo, we're not going to do anything about implementation. Of course we are, but, get us the rules, and then we're going to move directly to that. And we'll certainly come back and have conversations and reporting back on that kind of stuff for sure.
Right. So I think so far I've noted one potential modification that has come out of this conversation to the rule. And I think this sort of builds on a number of people's comments, and that is adding something to 2125, perhaps a new section H that would specifically identify a social equity curricula, right, as a part of that laundry list. I think Jennifer suggested, I think that's sort of, I've heard that come from other places. And again, with the goal today being that we're trying to land the plane on a stable draft that the board can vote on with respect to the rule, to Heather's point. I think all of this conversation is good, and I think it reflects the commitment and excitement on the part of the board for wanting to see this work done well. And when interested and excited people get together, we have conversations about these things. But I do want to bring us back. That's the one item that I have noted in the conversation. So I'm just going to put a pin in that one. Okay, and I do want to sort of solicit additional input and thoughts on, again, focusing the conversation on the rule text that we have now and questions people have about the rule text that they need to have answered in order to make an informed decision for a vote, or if they have specific additions, corrections, modifications, et cetera, to the rule text that we have in front of us right now. So I saw some hands go up there. I think, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think I saw Tom's hand go, and then Lyle, and then Jennifer. Did I get the order right? It's hard. In Zoom, they give you a number so I can keep track, but I'm not sure I got that order right. Shall I start with Tom?
Yeah, so happy to go. I'm going to go to the comments, and I think they're Lyle's comments, and it's on both civic and community engagement and college and career readiness. The response said that a clarification regarding a suggested edit would be welcome, and I'm wondering if those if that clarification has been given, if the idea would be to take out the language that seemed to be tagged on, or if there were edits and or discussion about edits, and I just wasn't there at the meeting.
I don't know if it's helpful, and Tammy, I think we just read it differently and didn't see it to appear as separate and tagged on. So we weren't sure if there was a specific recommendation for language change, and knowing the extent of the diverse group that offered the language, and then our 3 or 4 of us, when we had Patrick having reviewed the language, not experiencing it in the same way, we just weren't exactly sure if there was something specific that we should be considering from Lyle's observation. And so Tammy and I left it as was and didn't know if there was something more to expand on Lyle, that because we didn't read it similarly, but we also appreciate that fresh eyes are helpful.
And just to bring before I let Lyle respond, just to bring the whole board onto the same page, if you're looking at the response of the committee, it's number 6 and 7, and these are comments with respect to Lyle's helpful comments with respect to the definitions of civic and community engagement and college and career readiness. So just so everybody can find it in their document. Lyle, do you want to jump in here?
Well, I think I was just looking for other examples. For example, with civic and community engagement. When I first read that, I thought, well, that also includes volunteerism and community service, as well as social justice movements. It just seems like there are more examples of what civic and community engagement and college and career readiness might be. I don't know where you stop in putting down examples, but you could go on forever, I'm sure. I'm content with the responses. I mean, it's just the way, as you just said, it's the way I read it at the time, and it was the first thing I thought about when I read it. I wonder if others will feel the same way. So I'm not ready to throw myself down in front of the school bus, so I'm okay.
I think generally the committee, and I would call in both Kim and Tom on this, we were at times concerned about creating lists of examples in general, right? Because, when you provide examples, it prioritizes certain things over others, even when you say including but not limited to, right? It signals, and I think that's what you're talking about here. And in a number of places, we worked really hard, for example, in not naming specific ethnic groups and coming up with broader descriptors, right? So I think that a good example on that is the indigenous peoples of Vermont, rather than calling out specific tribes, making it more general. I think sort of this comment falls in that lane. I know that some of the members of the Act One working group felt strongly about providing these as examples because these were places that they were most concerned about activities that might run counter to some of the principles in Act One, but I only provide that as context, not commentary on your comments. Just a little bit, like this idea of list building was something that we struggled with at times as a committee. So
I agree, and Lyle, because as you build lists, the things that you include provide a flavor and a bias, and the things you don't include do the same thing. I think that's more of a case in civic and community engagement, that list. The college and career readiness one, the way I read it was if these rules do their job and if the standards do their job, then all of our graduates will be equipped to be successfully employed and work in environments that are socially and culturally inclusive because they will have been educated in a certain way. So that one, I think, is in line with just the work that we're doing. The other list, like I said, there's we always questioned whether or not where we should stop the list. So I just wondered whether you were suggesting that we drop any of those items from the list or not. I guess that was my more specific question.
I guess thank you, Tom. I think I would need to go back and read it again in the context of I'm looking for it now and I don't want to waste everyone else's time. So I'll go back and reread that based on what you all have just said. Thank you.
And Lyle, if after reading that you have a specific edit in mind, it'd be helpful if you could just shoot that to the committee.
Sure.
Maybe today. If we're going to make a proposed change, we need to get that in language in the document so that the document is stable for a vote. Okay. I think the next hand I saw go up was Jennifer.
Great. So I saw that you all put new language in, I think it's 2125. It's at the very end of, am I right? Wait,
Yeah.
hang on.
The end of the continuous improvement plan.
The end of it's Rule 2125. An SUSD school board shall approve the plan annually and establish a process for receiving and responding to written public feedback. So my question is, I know that the subcommittee had discussed this in earlier meetings, the idea of having a complaint process in the rule. And I don't think that this sentence takes care of that. The way I read this sentence is that, you know, the school board is approving a plan and it's going to solicit public feedback and append that public feedback to the plan. But my question really goes to, how do these rules provide a mechanism for someone who feels that the rules are not being complied with? Like what recourse does that person have? So like, for instance, if a student isn't receiving socially or culturally responsive learning opportunities, where do they go? And I think, you know, Tammy, I'd heard you mention earlier that, you know, these rules are really trying to elevate the voices of people who, you know, maybe haven't always had a seat at the table. Mm-hmm. So I think that it would be really helpful in the interest of, you know, transparency to, you know, have something in there that says, like, if a student or a family member or an educator feels like there's some aspect that is not being adhered to, what's the process? And if the process says, you know, go talk to the principal and then the superintendent and then, you know, the school board, okay. But I mean, I think that process should be put in there just so that it's clear, so that there's clear instructions for people who may not know how to navigate that.
Let me ask a question as a follow-up. Are you suggesting that in following this statement in 2125, that there's more detail put in there regarding a process?
Well, I'm not sure that it's limited to the continuous improvement plan. I think this.
That's why I'm asking. These are two separate things. So it's not specific. What you're suggesting is that there needs to be a process for voice, right, on the part of families and students and communities, if in fact they feel as if principles of the EQS, particularly with respect to sort of social justice and racial equity, are not being adhered to in a SUSD. There needs to be a way for that to percolate and be reviewed and considered. I'm just trying to make sure that I understand, right? Because there's comments on the plan and then there's comments over here, and I want to make sure that we're clear on sort of where you think the point of concern needs to be.
I think this is an overarching concern about the body of Rule Series 2000. So I think it needs, I mean, I would recommend that it be its own rule that just goes to what the process is if someone feels that the rules are not being complied with.
So that would be akin to what we have in 2200, where there's a complaint process.
Yeah, and you know, obviously I don't think it would be the same language, because I think that the structure of the public school system is different than the structure of an independent school system. So I wouldn't, but I think it's analogous.
Okay. Right, Kim, I know you were trying to.
I think the challenge, and Tammy and I talked quite a bit about it, is that we don't have authority. I didn't see there to be authority for us to require a policy that would require districts to have a policy on compliance with equity standards, or an equity policy, for instance. And I don't think that was within our authority. And so outside of that, we would end up with a challenge in school districts to have a mechanism that's clear about a board's authority to remedy problems as they're raised. Things like the hazing, harassment, and bullying policy have very specific conditions and processes for a school to know and to be laid out very specifically. Title IX policy, similarly. So in the absence of policy, I know, like, the concern if there's discrimination in 2200 is they can go to the Human Rights Commission. And I think it's different in public schools. That is, of course, always a process. But if we were to get as specific as to outline, first you speak with your teacher, then you speak with your principal, then you speak with your superintendent, and then it goes to the board, and then it can be appealed to the agency and then appealed to the state board. I think we would be usurping the opportunity for there to be remedy in any of those individual situations, and we may be offering a weight to a document that is their strategic plan that drives their budget in every school district, is supported or not by their communities through vote. Their membership on boards is supported or not by communities on vote. There's many public school reporting requirements that go to the AOE already. And so there are data that are being considered in theory by the AOE as to whether or not there's compliance or improvement in their plan year over year. I think importantly, the creation of the plan needs to be informed by, let me just get to who the plan must include a diverse group of people in building the plan.
Kim,
and we had
I just want to tie your comments back to Jennifer's comments. I think, Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong, you are suggesting that there needs to be a process that's not specific to the plan. Is that what I'm hearing? Okay.
That is correct.
Yeah.
Right. So I just want to make sure that when we're having a conversation, we're talking about the same thing. So I'm hearing Jennifer talk about the fact that there needs to be a process where communities, families, students who feel as if the EQS isn't being implemented in their current situation, there's a way of elevating those concerns, right, and having them resolved through a process versus comments on a plan on the SIP, which is what we have here now, right? That there are comments on the SIP, and that those comments are folded into sort of the SIP as it moves forward, right? And are adjudicated sort of through that process. So it feels to me like we're talking about two different things here. So I just want to clarify that it sounds like we're talking about two different things.
I just am recognizing, though, that the entirety of the EQS is fully articulated or supposed to be reflected in the continuous improvement plan. I don't know where else there is a mechanism for districts to be either reporting out, and if we think about the annual reporting requirements, those are left to local decision making on how it's reported. So it would be inconsistent to establish a very prescribed process in this place, and then for something as important as how districts, I think Lyle may have brought this up before, how districts are reporting out the required metrics each year, to have that be left to the discretion of every board and how they report it. That's an inconsistent level of specificity on things that I think are both very important, which is why I think it'd be beneficial to respond to written public feedback on compliance with the EQS. We could add that there, just because the SIP is the one thing that's reported on annually and is supposed to be reviewed annually by a diverse group representative of the community, schools, teachers, administration, and board. I was trying to find the the real tool for doing it.
Well, and I see that Heather has been sort of variously nodding her head yes and no. So I'm wondering if would can we call on Heather?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Thanks. So I do really want to caution again, as I've shared with Tammy and with Kim and with Chair Samuelson, the way we have enacted the continuous improvement plan, which we call the CIP in the agency, is squarely aligned with federal requirements. So I know that the phrase continuous improvement plan has for a long time been within board rule. I do not want to give the impression that there is a separate state continuous improvement plan that magically addresses, magically is a little too glib, but that actually separately addresses each of the EQS. That is not what the continuous improvement plan that we adopt is. It really cleaves with federal requirements under ESEA. So I'd be happy to kind of share what that looks like with folks. I think there is certainly overlap with a lot of what's in the EQS, certainly some of those performance standards that we know about, certainly the requirement to disaggregate findings and specify interventions for targeted groups of vulnerable students. But I continue to get a little anxious about this part of the conversation because I worry there's some misalignment. So the agency has never taken what's in the rules as a separate continuous improvement plan that speaks to what's in EQS separate from the process that's required under IDEA. And if anything, the assumption from the agency, I believe, was that the continuous improvement plan that is referenced in state board rule is actually reflective of what's required under IDEA. And so I just really want to clarify that from the agency's
under IDEA and
perspective.
ESSA, right? Both? Not just IDEA.
Not IDEA, excuse me, under ESEA. Yeah,
Okay,
which is
just
the
making
latest
sure.
instantiation. No, thanks. I slid a
right
different
there.
acronym in there, Tammy.
Wait,
Thank
what
you. Thank you. That was a baddie. No, it is not required under IDEA. That's a whole other set of plans, as we know.
Set of plans.
So the other thing I would say is I actually really understand what you were saying, sure, Kim, about like the complexity of EQS and how, like, what are the guidelines, if you will, of how, like, what could be sort of a complaint could be lodged about, like, what is the substance of a complaint under EQS? And I do think that's something that would be perhaps important to continue to reflect on, maybe in some follow-up work. But what I really liked about what Chair Samuelson said is that, so on a practical level, we get a lot of requests for help, a lot of challenges, or we experience a lot of questions from parents who say, this is not happening across a whole variety of things that are beyond HHB or beyond what's happening with the IEP process, which do have very formalized processes to follow. I actually think it's worth further consideration because what we say is your option is to go to your principal, first start, with the classroom. If that doesn't work, go to the principal. If that doesn't work, go to the district leader, the superintendent. And if that doesn't work, go to the board. Because of local control, that's what we can provide for you. I like kind of formalizing that somewhere because then it not only codifies what we've been suggesting, it actually gives it a place, but it also alerts the district and the school that, like, this is something that they shouldn't be surprised if this occurs. Like, the parent is actually following a process that's actually been, even if it's just been in practice, it's happening. So for whatever that's kind of a bon mot about that, I do think there could be some real benefit to that, because I think it's more transparent about what's really happening. I agree with Kim. Does this mean it would be, that we would support like a complete influx of complaints? Like I see that whatever, picking a small thing, like I'm just making an example, like, EQ, this is ridiculous, right? But EQS said that you're supposed to have blue walls, and I'm realizing that like my classroom doesn't have blue walls. So I'm making a silly point, but I do think that is a risk, right? That like any tiny thing could be brought up as a complaint, and I do think that's a risk. But I see
I wonder whether there's
some of the benefits.
Both. It seems to me like there's an and in both here, right? And so there needs to be a local process for complaints, right? And there also needs to be an escape valve of sorts, which allows the agency to know that the local process failed in somehow, right? Because if you think about it, if we make it entirely a local process, it can be the case, and we see this around the country when we're dealing with issues of equity, that you have dominant voices running a school district, running a school board, and marginalized and minoritized individuals, no matter how much they complain, that voice is never elevated outside of that school district, and therefore it's never heard, it's never accounted for. And so I think we have an and in both here, right? So I think we need to think carefully about mandating a complaint process, but also there needs to be some sort of tripwire that at some point that a complaint that has not been satisfied or apparent, right, that the agency knows about that. And to point this out, in 2126.2, and I know you've seen this, Heather, right? Like that information needs to come in with the SIP, that the number of complaints or the kind of complaints or documentation, because the agency also needs to take that into account when they're deciding whether or not a school is complying with EQS. Because it can be the case that the superintendent or the school board simply says we're compliant. And those are the dominant voices that are controlling the conversation, and the marginalized voices, the minoritized voices those ideas don't make it out. And so I'm wondering whether we need to have an and in both here, which is we establish a complaint process, but we also have a way in here and make sure that complaints are elevated. And I think the idea is that because the SIP is already coming to the agency, right, that this would be appended, like that would be a way for the agency to see or know, right, that there are lingering concerns or ways, because the other option is that the escape valve is at some point the complaints directly come to the agency, and then the agency is then responsible for looking at these complaints individually, which is kind of what happens over on the independent school side, right? Like at some point, these complaints elevate to a point where they're evaluated independently by the agency. And I'm also cognizant of the fact that the agency's got a lot on its plate. So I'm seeing.
But we also then, and also, Tammy, not to interrupt you, but like to what end? So, right. So like we don't, so, okay, they can come to us, but like, we don't have any like funds to withhold linked to EQS like we do in other places. And so I think that's already what's happening, is that they're rising to our level, and we're basically turning it right back to you've got to work at the local level. And so I think the regulatory framework would have to change for there to be some kind of action based on that. And
that was the intent in adding letter C in 2126.2 around the review, right, the annual process of determining whether or not a school complied with the EQS, which was that the agency would have to consider public feedback, right? Consider the information generated through this complaint or public feedback process, right? And in doing so, that allows you then to flip into, the other process, the other processes that are in statute that allow you to address deficiencies with the EQS. So the intent, I think what I hear is we all sort of want the same goals. What I'm hearing is that the language isn't quite right in the document right now. And so in the effort to think about trying to land the plane here, what I'm hearing is that perhaps we need to get a small group to come back and look. This again was the committee's first attempt at this. And, that's great. This is why we're having the discussion today, is to have feedback on this. But what I'm hearing is perhaps this is something we need to come back with we need to think about it a little bit more and come up back with some cleaner language on this that executes on that intent, which I hear everybody sort of has the same goal here. It's just sounded like the language isn't quite right. and admittedly, this was first pass language, right? This is something that percolated last week, and I think the committee did its best to try to start this conversation. So,
and I've looked at this in depth, and so but so I agree with you, Tammy. Like this, I've looked at this already in depth, and none of this kind of came up as like oh gosh, that's going to be problematic. So I want to both own that, and then also agree with you that I think part of what we're still doing is really trying out the language and yeah, I appreciate that.
Well, and I think to your good point, Heather, what we're trying to lay out here is a regulatory framework that reflects our common goals, which is I don't, at least I can speak for myself. What I don't want to have happen is that we have dominant voices in communities that that marginalized voices, which is really at the heart of some of our equity concerns, have no way of raising their hand and getting their voices heard when there are, right, when the EQS and the principles of the EQS aren't being implemented as intended, right? There needs, and I call it an escape valve, there has to be some place in this process, and that to me falls at the very heart of making sure that we establish sort of an equitable structure in the state, because we know how racism works. We know, right? Like we know how power and privilege work, and that's very much at the heart of power and privilege. Kim?
And I think similarly, the bad actor, if you will, looking to upend the intention of this work could easily craft complaint that they feel
that's true too.
No longer served in their privilege in their districts, and without a policy practice that is a disciplined board's work for that process to flow through, you would end up with a I may sound scarred. I've lived there, and it requires a lot of time that is in contrary to the work often, and consequently it could be an outsized voice of well-organized people that would take advantage of the very thing we're trying to ensure allows space for those who feel as though the standards aren't being sought to be complied with, or aren't there yet, or weren't in their experience. We want space for that. But if it's not articulated in policy, so it has a process in a district, it really runs a risk of doing an end run around thoughtful work that is multi-year, that is resourced by budgets, that is importantly strategic planning style document that moves systems. So that's where I caution us to think, in the absence of a required policy, that we would have necessarily I'm not sure where I would see our authority to establish a specifically defined process versus saying there should be a process and invite them to do that. If you have an equity policy on your books, you probably have a process within your district. But we don't have capacity, at least as I see it. If somebody sees it differently, I'd love to require an equity policy. But I don't see that.
I hear a couple things here, and we do, in our process that we have going on right now, we do have the ability to say things, to provide feedback to the legislature, and perhaps one of the things the legislature should consider is, as a part of next step, is around creating some mandates for an equity policy. To your point, that's outside our purview. But what I hear here is a lot of shared concern. I think, Kim, you raised some other really good points here, and I'm wondering whether we need to get a small group together and craft some language here, that take another pass at the language, and have that language ready to go for next week for the full board to consider, if that sounds like a next step. Again, I'm trying to get some concrete steps here so that we can solidify the rule. I'm curious about how, Jennifer, Kim, What do you think? I think that might be if the board is willing to sort of delegate that back out to a small group, and we can take whomever on that group that'd like to be. It's hard to draft language with a large committee, but thoughts on that?
I'm happy to jump in and help on that. As a practical matter, I have a kid graduating from college and I'm leaving town tomorrow morning and won't be back until, midnight Sunday/Monday. So
Congratulations.
I have to like wave the flag on that one. I mean, if it's Monday, I'd be happy to do it.
Can I ask a question too for a practical matter? If we were to put as a placeholder, add to the end of that sentence on the compliance with EQS, so it would read, an SUSD school board shall approve the plan annually and establish a process for receiving and responding to written public feedback on compliance with EQS, period. Leaves it to locals. Then it is again referenced that when they file it, they're filing it along with their responses to the written public feedback. And then when we get to your review at the AOE level, among the things you may consider is that submitted feedback. And we've not taken any testimony from the field on this. So to understand how it would work in the absence of policy in school districts that are ideally operating through a process and policy themselves, it would put a placeholder that requires them to have a process. And if in ICAR, we have specific feedback on that, we would have better informed. A few of us sitting around not doing this work are going to have a hard time in any amount of time, probably coming up with something that has the balance between requiring something but not telling people how to do it, which is consistent with what we've done on 21-24 and that the law does with saying you must report these things. But to Lila's point, there's a challenge that's going to not be consistently done because it doesn't say how to report it, but the law doesn't allow us to say how you must report. It must be accessible. It must be, there are a few things that it must be, but the law doesn't tell us how you have to report. And that's a pretty big deal. Like you're required annually to report. Here we are adding something.
So I'm hearing Kim make a suggestion here that we should consider as a group, right? Which is to take that sentence and it says, right now it reads, an SUSD school board shall approve the plan annually and establish a process for receiving and responding to written public feedback, and amending that to say on the EQS. Or this rule
on compliance with the EQS.
On compliance with the EQS. We can
or however
we can fit around this exact words, but the sentiment is that as a placeholder for now, adding that so that it's feedback specific to the EQS, so they'd have to develop a process, and then letting the other parts.
My concern.
It doesn't. Okay, that's the question. So it doesn't address their concern. So then I think we need to get a small group together to try to come up with some language that sort of strikes some middle ground here. But it sounds like we can't do that till early next week. So I guess my question back to the full board would be, if we were to get a stable document with the exception of that, and recognizing that that might have to still be a discussion point next week, how comfortable is the board with that and feeling as if they're going to have enough time and the tools they need to make a decision on that language with that much runway before the next meeting?
I would say I would be more comfortable if we were able to pose that question out to superintendents and school boards, the Vs, some version of the Vs.
Well, I think the trade-off is if we do that, then I don't know. I mean, then we're in the business of having to give some consideration to whether or not we do a vote next week, which throws us off for getting this into.
No, I don't. I guess that is, I think, the challenge, and that is why I offered that placeholder for a broad process that then could be further explored in direct response to public comment, so that we could, and certainly we can offer our own public comment. I know last time when we were doing 2200, AOE had public comment to consider as well when we were doing 2200, because technically there were updates that made sense in that, and we took those in public comment early on in the ICAR feedback or whatever. I'm just concerned about us drawing out a very specific process without being informed by testimony at the second time the state board is having a special meeting on this. So I appreciate that we want to ensure that there is space for voices that feel not heard in this work.
So I just want to call in others who haven't been part of this smaller conversation here. So Tom, Mohammed, Lyle, Jenna, Richard.
Yeah, I would love to jump in. I didn't want to interrupt anybody, but I believe we all have great intentions here. And hopefully you all understand the way I understand it too. Whenever you mention something as a rule, there's an expectation it should have a process or procedure to implement it. And then hence, once it is implemented, one would think of what consequences there could be if someone failed to implement it. So that's, I think of this in terms of laws. When people end up going to Secretary Bushy all the time with complaints, where in the rules that stated that's where they should go straight. No, they should not. It doesn't say that, but they do come to her anyway. Or they would go to a principal anyway, or they go to a board member. And the problem with board members from experience is like, I'm going to say, when I say, like I said earlier, when we teach students to become culturally competent, I want to also ensure board members are well-versed or competent in addressing this kind of issues at a legal perspective, at an equity lens, at an inclusion lens, like many of you echoed already. If the marginalized individual, and that could be a student, it could be a parent, it could be a staff member, it could be an administrator too. If they do not have oftentimes this great relationship with a board member, then whatsoever could happen. But to establish a rule, we really need some kind of language. I understand, like Tammy said, time is tight, but we really got to come up with something before we are able to approve this. If not, you approve something and you don't have any set of words for it, then it comes back to us.
Yeah. Okay, others?
So I would be comfortable with a small group meeting early next week, getting feedback from the V's, if possible, between now and that meeting. Because then in our meeting next week, as a full board, we would have a targeted, this would be a targeted action item we would take a look at. I would rather do that, at least try to do that before next week, recognizing that Kim says we still have the option. We might decide to go with that language. We would still have the option during the rest of the rulemaking process. So I'm in favor of a group trying to flesh this out before our meeting next week.
Great.
I can squeeze some time in too. I forgot to mention that piece. I could squeeze some time into this to bring us up to speed and hopefully are able to do something at the next board meeting.
I think it would have to go back to the committee, because otherwise we run the risk of open meeting law and having too many people. So I think if we're going to have a small group, it's going to need to go back to the committee to work on. It probably makes sense. And so what I'm hearing is, I do see Richard's hand. I want to call him in just a moment. But I think the decision we're making is, should the committee go back and try to draft some language based on the input that we're receiving here? But it sounds like we might not be able to do that till early next week. And I would just want to be clear that if we do that, you will get a draft without that language in it at the end of the week. But knowing that, to Tom's point, you would have a targeted piece of language, but that will be coming in later. And I'm just being sensitive to the amount of time people need to read and think and prep for the meeting. Richard, and then I want to shift the conversation. We still have a major issue to discuss on the independent schools, and I want to be able to shift that to Richard and then Jennifer.
So I just want to echo kind of what everybody else says, and Tammy, you and Kim really helped me last time because I thought it had to be perfect, and when you said it doesn't, so I would really be all for you folks, the smaller group to go look at it. I think you get more done. And then I think, we have the ability to do, even if we approve it at the next meeting, it's still got a whole bunch of processes still to go. So I would definitely be in favor of that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Richard. I'm sorry, Lyle, I saw Lyle's hand and then Jennifer, please.
Thank you. I want to thank Kim for talking me through an issue yesterday. And I just want to, in case anyone else read it the same way I did, and this is a very in the weeds comment, but under, let's see, it's under instructional practices and educators shall be supported in, and it may still be M, but it says fostering classroom culture based on the tenets of restorative justice practices, relationships, respect, responsibility, repair, and reintegration. I read that as that we were providing or requiring schools to provide professional development in restorative justice practices. And then Kim said that's not necessarily the case, that schools would be required to be working on relationships, respect, responsibility, repair, and reintegration. So I don't know if other people read that the same way I did, but I don't want people to think that we're requiring schools to implement restorative justice practice policy or something. So
Well,
just
to help as a guidepost to the community, this section number that where you're to
2120.1 and page 14 in the version I've got. I think that was the last version that everybody has from the website.
And you are referring to subsection M.
Yes.
2120.1 subsection M.
Yep.
Thank you. I just want to make sure everybody sees what you're saying. I agree with Kim, but I also will acknowledge that my bias is my head's been pretty down in the weeds on this. And so I really appreciate sort of the big, the treetop view on these things is very helpful. So I guess if it's raising a question, is the request for the committee then to go back and take a look at that, Lyle, to see if we can further clarify that meaning in that section? Would that be the request?
Well, maybe it's a question of other people. Did they feel like this was us saying that schools should be training their teachers in restorative justice practices as a policy or procedure? I think that there isn't a separate rule, and I think Kim sent it to me, around what is required discipline-wise by schools. And it does not say specifically you need to use this procedure. And I'm hearing through the rest of this conversation, we're not requiring specific procedures, but the outcomes need to be X.
What I might say in response to that, Lyle, is that you are a veteran and talented administrator, and if you read it that way, that raises concerns for me that others might read it that way, and that suggests to me that we need to go back and take a closer look at that language. That's rightly, we as a committee have asked lots of times around implementability and interpretation, and so this hasn't come up, but that doesn't mean that it's not a really valid concern. So from my perspective, I think what you flagged is something the committee needs to go back and look at to make sure that the language is precise enough so that administrators understand what the rule is asking them to do.
I don't know if it's helpful in response as well. There are a couple of places, and maybe Heather can speak to it as well, where there are resources, there are guidance documents on restorative practices from the AOE, and in 2019 they offered grant funding to support training in that arena. So I think it probably is, maybe, I don't know if it's a preferred method of practice or it is a supported method of practice through the AOE resources for school districts. I think that it came about in response to I believe, as I'm reading, it came about in response to the exclusionary practices and discipline and otherwise as a mechanism and a tool, and that those guideposts of that practice are important, whether it falls under the capital letters of restorative justice practices or otherwise. But Heather, I don't want to interpret that wrong.
I think that's all the case. What I'm hearing Lyle say is that he feels as if the language as an administrator might not understand the language as written as to what is being asked of them. And all along we have asked those questions of the field. And if this is an instance where an administrator might be unclear around the intent, then I think we just need to go back and discuss it and try to clarify that language. I don't hear that this is a question around policy or implementation. I think this is just, if I'm understanding correctly, Lyle, this is, just needing some clarification around what's being asked. Am I understanding correctly, Lyle?
You are, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Jennifer, and then Jenna.
I think Jenna was first.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I hate the fact that it doesn't number them, right? Because I can't tell whose hands get up first. I apologize. I'm trying to be attentive to that. So thank you.
Tammy, mine are numbered. So I don't know what platform you're on.
Mine are not.
I don't know. They are. Mine's really super quick. I'm going to agree with Lyle that capital R, capital J, restorative justice is a model also, right? It's a training model. So educators may read this as a training model. I also think it's fine to say the tenets of, or list those things and write restoration. I mean, I think like you can imply restorative without using the words restorative justice practices, because that's a model, it's an art, it's training, it's investment. I think if I was reading this as like Lyle said, I'd be like,
that's great.
Unless I was a school that was already doing it, then I'd be like, oh, this is awesome.
Yeah.
And I apologize. I apologize to Heather because I go automatically to implementation all the time. So I need to stay higher than that. So
well, I think it's helpful to have, I mean, certainly our committee has implementability in mind, but I think the kind of implementability that is important for the state board to consider is just like what you raised, like how will this be understood and interpreted as a rule? And I think this is a good example. So, and Jenna, I think your suggestions are helpful. So I've added this to the list of things that we need to go back and look at before next week. Thank you. Jennifer?
Sure. So 2 points. I'm going to agree with Jenna and Lyle, and just point out that 2120.1, the lead sentence is educators shall be supported in, and then you drop to M, fostering a classroom culture based on the tenets of restorative justice practices. So I think the mandatory aspect of that is the fostering the classroom culture. It's a little less, I mean, it's a little more attenuated whether you're requiring them to enact restorative justice practices, but they are at least being required to foster a classroom culture based on that. So I think Jenna's suggestion of just taking that language out and, really focusing on the underlying principles might be a nice solution to that issue. Yep. The other thing I was going to say back on the complaint process, if the agency were willing to just kind of lay out, I mean, I think we've all discussed it and probably most of us sitting here know it, that if a student feels aggrieved, the process is, teacher, principal, superintendent, school board, it could be that simple. I don't think we're reinventing the wheel here. I think my point was it just needs to be published so that someone who might not know where to go and what the steps are knows where to go and what the steps are. And if there's, statutory support for, principal or teacher, principal, superintendent, school board, then we can just kind of hook it on to that. We're not reinventing the wheel here. We're just bringing the process forward so that everyone knows what that process is.
Great. Thank you. That's helpful. And I think, Heather, if you're okay, the committee can work with you to craft some language that reflects what is already practice on the part of the agency.
But Jennifer, there's no there's no law.
Okay. No.
So it is going to be,
a practice.
It's just
Yeah.
practice. All
Yep.
it's doing is codifying to some extent in a role that established practice on the agency, which I know has been carefully thought out given the balance between the role of the state aid authority versus governance here, right? You know, what you can and cannot do, and sort of in our local control environment. Excellent. I'm feeling compelled at this point to try to shift us a little bit. You know, we do have about 15-20 minutes here left. We do have a major issue still to discuss, and that is the to whom question. You know, in your handouts, I'm going to try to truncate the wind up to this conversation. So we had some of that wind up last time with respect to the options that the committee has considered, being option A and sort of option B as starting points for conversation. One, having it, one option would be to insert the language that you see in the current draft, which would apply selected sections of the EQS to independent schools, approved independent schools. The other option that was considered by the committee was not doing that in the EQS and opening up Rule 2200, which is where sort of the compendium of rules for independent schools exist, and engaging in a process there to update the 2200 series to reflect, to the extent possible, the exact same requirements that we would have in the EQS with respect to the Act 1 principles, but bring those over and infuse those in the 2200 series in a similar way so that the two rules mirror each other. So the intent is that to make sure that the principles of Act 1 apply to all students, right? So that's sort of a common basis for both of these. The idea is which is the most appropriate regulatory mechanism, the EQS, through sort of selective application of certain sections, or to do that through the 2200 series, where the Rule 2200 is updated in ways to make sure that independent schools, students attending independent schools are afforded the same rights and quality of education with respect to equity and justice. So those are the two things on the table. Before we move forward with the discussion, I think, again, the discussion needs to be focused on what do people need to make a decision about this, right? Because this really is sort of two forks in the road. I think so. We want to keep the discussion focused on, but I'd actually like to just start with a straw poll to see where people are with respect to the two options. And I think that will kind of help us figure out how to focus the discussion and focus our time around resolving that question. So I'm going to say sort of option A is the modify the EQS to have it apply, certain sections applied to independent schools. And option B is going to be, you know, do something in the 2200 series. And they are as general as that at this point. I know there are specifics, but if we can get some sense of where people are landing right now in terms of whether you think we should be really digging into an option A or option B, I think that would be helpful to start our conversation. So can I just get a show of hands or so with respect to
Tammy?
Yes.
Before we do that, I have to admit I'm a little confused because,
Mm-hmm.
You know, the agency has been on record before that in black and white, like language, the EQS don't extend to independent schools. So I am a little bit confused about option A.
So we have a document that's been reviewed by legal counsel that suggests that these two options may be viable. And so the issue is and this committee has taken testimony on both of these things. And in our last meeting, and I'm not remembering how, I think you may not have been at the last meeting, the committee voted out and said that we thought this was a discussion that the full board needed to engage in, and they've been provided a lot of information around that, these two different approaches to doing that. And so the option A is not to apply the EQS in its entirety to independent schools, in fact, which is what the agency weighed in on. The option A is to apply certain sections of the EQS to independent schools, and that those sections of law are those sections that already apply equally to independent schools and to regular public schools. So it's not the entirety. So the committee rejected the recommendation by the Act 1 working group to apply the EQS in its entirety to independent schools. That's off the table. What is on the table is a selective application of certain sections, and those certain sections are already in statute as implying, right? These are parts of the rule that implement statute that applies equally to independent schools and to public schools. Okay, so sort of that we've moved on from the conversation of does this apply, and so that was what the agency weighed in on at the time.
And if it's helpful, Heather, to point to exactly what those are, it's on page 5, and it was in 2113 already applies to independent schools. That's federal and state entitlements and non-discrimination. That already applies to public and independent schools. And 2120.1 and 0.5, which is the sections that are most reflective of the changes that were within Act 1 with just respect to anti-racist, non-discriminatory education and the requirements there. And then finally, in I think the school environment already also applies to independent schools and public schools. So that was 2122.1, and then definitions, because you can't operationalize this if you're not familiar with the definitions as well. So those were the sections
right.
in that due to Act 1, and we brought in, I don't remember, Heather, if you were here for the special meeting last time, but we invited Coach Kevin Christie, who was one of the architects of the Act 1 legislation back in 2019, to speak with our full state board regarding intent of Act 1. And he and I think the board felt that it is the intent that these principles would apply for all Vermont students. It was more the tool. So I wasn't sure if you had the opportunity to catch up on that, Heather.
And the slides are available for you too as well, Heather. So just want to refocus the discussion back here. I think it'd be helpful to take a straw poll. So that gives us all sort of a chance to say sort of where are we as a board on this issue? And if we are far apart, then we need to figure out how it is that we answer questions and clarify concerns to try to move this forward. So if I could get a sense of sort of a show of hands of folks who are thinking that option A, and that is would be their preferred approach to addressing this issue, that is selectively applying sections of the EQS to independent schools. How many people are thinking that that would be the option that they would prefer?
Do you like committee members to weigh in as well?
Yeah, that's fine. Just raise your hands. So I have Kim. How many folks are thinking option B, that their preferred approach would be to open up the 2200 series and update that to reflect Act 1? I see Jennifer, I see Lyle, I see Jenna, I see Mohammed. I'm having a hard time seeing hands from Richard and Tom.
My hand is up.
Is it? Thank you. I'm just not seeing your picture on my screen. Okay, so it sounds like we have quite a bit of consensus for going with the updating the 2200 series. With that, are there specific questions that people need to have answered around their preferred option either way, in order to take a vote on this? I mean, this will be part of the drive. So as a next step, I think what this signals is we need to take out the language that has the selective sections in it, and that, right? But is there additional questions or clarifications that are needed?
I don't know. The others, you can go first. I was just wondering, as we consider opening 2200 in light of the bill that was going through 483 had in it an annual attestation for independent schools. And Jennifer, you are really good about statutes. So if we reopen 2200 to reflect, and we could ask the Act 1 working group for recommendations for language for 2200, because they, I believe, will be continuing their work and they might be able to do that aligned with, because hopefully not as big a lift for them as doing all of EQS. They could take that which they view as important, that is, you know, as Tammy said, bring in those values to the 2200 process. So if we were able to do that, do you feel comfortable that we are also able to put in an annual attestation on 2200?
Yeah, so a couple points. One is, I think it makes, I mean, I just raised my hand. I think it makes sense to reopen 2200. I think that's much cleaner. We don't mention public schools in the 2200 series, even though there are statutes that apply to both. I mean, this just feels cleaner to me. So I think, you know, I'm in support of that. I think since we just had 2200 open, you know, we had talked about reopening it to sort of catch any things that we didn't get the first time around. And I think we all agree that we had expected the attestation to be, well, maybe not the attest, we expected compliance last May. And what I failed to appreciate, and I think maybe others have failed to appreciate, is that having that requirement in the 2200 didn't translate into this mechanism to ensure compliance. So I think that's where we've been sort of struggling this whole year to say we've got a rule that's in effect. How do we capture that? So I think it would be entirely appropriate, and sort of going back to what we had talked about in the 2200 phase 1 series, that this is one of those things that we didn't anticipate, that this would be a really great opportunity to clean up. So I think that would be really helpful to do the attestation clause. I think the other thing too, you know, just thinking ahead here, when we sunsetted the Rule 7000 series, we discussed reopening 2200 to have a framework in place for what an accrediting agency would look like. And I know Tom's done a lot of prep work on that. So I think that would be a second point. And then the third point would be to implement the aspects of Act 1, you know, to put them into the 2200 series in a way that is appropriate. And I mean, frankly, I think what's going to be really helpful is to see, you know, what's the language that's coming out through the public rulemaking process with EQS, because I think that language should be parallel. You know, sort of high level, it should be parallel. There might be like tiny little differences that, you know, might be different, you know, might sort of sugar out differently because it's an independent school system versus a public school system. But conceptually, I think we're all in agreement that, you know, at the 30,000 foot level, the language should be similar. It should land similarly. So, you know, I look at those three discrete areas that we would reopen 2200 for. And I think we could probably do that pretty quickly.
Do you think, Jennifer, thank you so much, because that's helpful. Could we, I remain a little bit stuck on the idea of it being an independent school approval rule. I wonder if it might be independent school approval and standards rule, or like, I think we would want to consider something that basic, because by virtue of approval and knowing that process is a 2, 3, 5 year potential process for reapproval, we aren't clearly articulating that there is an ongoing expectation of attestation or ongoing expectation of complying with standards. So I think that would maybe benefit and probably be less confusing, that it is a guidance document for ongoing practice. And so I would encourage that we maybe consider that. And then finally, I think a thing that was lingering last time that I fear could cause a civil rights violation for students with special needs is the out-of-state tuition to independent schools without a requirement that they're approved to serve students with special needs in their state or province. I think that remains problematic. And we don't need to put our rules on them as long as they're approved to serve students with special needs in their state or province. I think we take ourselves out of it. And I think personally, I think province is hard because there could be different federal requirements that would mean our public dollars might be going in a discriminatory practice that from a federal standpoint. But anyway, within the United States, I don't worry about it,
Yeah,
but I
I
would
think
add that to our list. And I think that would be helpful as we're opening. I think that's something we recognize is a challenge come July 1. But
what I'm hearing from Jennifer is that just that it sounds as if there's a commitment to opening the 2200 series. It sounds in doing so, there may be other things in addition to ensuring sort of the principles of Act 1 are infused in that rule series. And my expectation is that that's a list that can be generated as we start to think about opening up 2200. But I think what's important for this committee and sort of our discussion here is that there is a commitment to open 2200, and that, you know, and with that commitment is this interest on the part of, I think we all share in this conversation, in making sure that the principles of Act 1 are applied in that rule equally to the extent possible and practicable, right, to independent schools. And so given that, I think then the decision, what I'm hearing for next, in having to prepare a document for a vote next week, is that that temporary text that's in there that would apply the EQS selective sections of the EQS to independent schools needs to come out, because we're going to address this issue in a different way. That's what I'm hearing here is in terms of consensus. Okay, great. All right, we did a lot of work today. I want to be attentive to time. It is 2:30. I see, just to go through my list, I think there are 3 broad issues the committee needs to work on here. One, considering adding something to section 2120.5, a new item that calls in a social equity standard. We need some language around that. That helpful comment came from Jennifer. This discussion around a complaint process and recognizing that would be probably coming as a separate document, not with this document, since it requires a little bit more commentary. And also I'm hearing some edits per Lyle, Jenna's helpful comments around 2120.m and thinking around the language there that refers to with precision currently restorative justice practices, but perhaps making that language more general to sort of an orientation toward classroom practice rather than referring to a specific type of practice that has a branding in and of itself. Those were the 3 big things that I caught that need to get cleaned up in the draft that would go to the full board for vote next week. Did I miss anything, Kim?
I don't think so. No, I was just going to ask Mohammed, in practicing in your district, I'm just wondering if you have any initial thoughts on the restorative practice, or if that's something you could follow up with us in terms of how we frame it in language, simply because I know you are probably operating within that in your current practice in your district.
I've been a lot. Thank you for mentioning that. With that being said, and the question raised is like really relevant. It's hard when you don't say this is mandatory to a school to take on, but if you leave it open-ended, from experience, it's like only people who are interested in it go for it. We have a weekly session for staff to attend. We call it circles, but the beginning was really good, and later on the numbers decreased.
So Mohammed,
yes.
If the committee drafts some revised text for that item, would that be something you would be willing to just review for us quickly?
Absolutely.
That would be great.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Any other items? Are people feeling as if, let me do a temperature check here. Are people feeling as if they have the information and the questions answered that they need to have answered in order to make an informed decision about a vote on this document with sort of the modifications that I just talked about next Wednesday? Because that really is the goal. Okay, great.
And a reminder on process.
Yeah. I feel like I say this every time, but I mean, this has been a monumental amount of work. I'm sure that there have been many sleepless nights, late nights, early mornings, everything in between. I really appreciate how well this meeting was navigated, and I realized the amount of time and preparation that went into that. So by everyone, I mean, you know, Kim, Tammy, I think you sort of were the front person on all of this, but I also realized that, you know,
Tom.
Yeah, we're very much involved with that. So, you know, this is the tip of the iceberg, and I realize there's like an entire glacier underneath that sort of fed into today's meeting. So thank you all.
Thank you. It's been a great committee, team effort, and I appreciate that sort of the conversation of the board at the last meeting and this meeting. I know these are issues we all care deeply about and we see the importance of, and you know, I think it's important to signal our concern and the priority around implementation, and we need to have a forum for that too. But I appreciate everybody's being focused today so we could get to a concrete document we can have a vote on. So
and
with that, Chair,
I was just going to say, we will get you. I think just to be understood, there'll be minor changes, and those may not get to you till Tuesday. I know. I think we would say that you should consider in your board package that which we provided, right? If we're not meeting till Monday and we're then meeting together as a board on Wednesday.
I think that only applies to the complaint language. I think the other things we're going to try to get done by Friday and have the complaint language to come as a
okay. Those were minor. The complaint language would be different. Well, I mean, we are still looking for feedback on restorative practice in a day. So and social equity standard.
I think we can do this quickly. So great. Chair Samuels, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. I see your hand is up.
Oh, wow. Sorry.
I just wanted to echo what Jennifer just said, which is I went back and looked at the number of meetings that you had and the amount of time you spent on this. And so kudos and thank you for doing that. That was a lot of time. And I apologize for my 11th hour notes to you. You answered every one of them. Thank you.
Please don't apologize. That was the intended process, right? You know, so all the comments are very helpful. And as you noted, you know, I think they raised some important issues that we were able to make some necessary modifications, but it's also helpful to the committee to have to reply, because I think then it just sort of crystallizes and makes clear sort of what our thinking was, so we could have today's discussion. So thank you.
All right. With that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make that motion.
Yeah, is there a second?
I have a 3 o'clock meeting.
I don't see a second. Someone, I'll second. All those in favor, please.
Jenna's right there. Good, Jenna. Thank you, everyone. See you next Wednesday in person.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks all.